This is one of my favorite topics as well. If you are a founder of a non-profit, if you're running a program on poverty alleviation, if you are and if you're wondering how programs scale in India and across countries, then this is a session that is really going to be useful. Do post your questions on the Q&A section, and I'll try my best to get some answers towards the end of the session from the JPAL team. It's really lovely to have you, Aparna, Gautam, and Shagun. Aparna is a project director at JPAL. She's currently in a project where she's engaging with the government of Tamil Nadu. She provides strategic leadership, management oversight to all research, policy outreach, and capacity building initiatives. She was, before this, building an initiative under the government of Tamil Nadu in an advisory role. She also served as the executive director of JPAL South Asia. And she has a master's in economics. She's also an MPIA from University of California, San Diego. Welcome, Aparna. We also have Gautam Patel, who is a senior policy manager at JPAL South Asia. He works to build partnerships with policymakers in the region to ensure that policy is driven by evidence and effective programs are scaled up. Before this, he worked on various roles in research and management positions for the governments of Gujarat, Rajasthan, and Oxfordshire. He graduated from the London School of Economics and Political Science. He also holds a master's in molecular and cellular biochemistry from the Oxford University. Shagun is the director of policy and training and communications at JPAL South Asia. She's also the director of the Clear South Asia Center. She leads the advancement of JPAL South Asia's partnerships with governments, donors, civil society organizations, and JPAL affiliates to establish new research, disseminate policy lessons, and scale up successful social programs. She, interestingly, is also a principal investigator for research and the adaptation of graduation approach by governments and enhancing frontline health worker motivation and performance in India. She worked before this with 3IE, and she's also a postdoctoral fellow at Population Council. Welcome, all three of you. For the viewers, this session is streaming on Zoom as well as on YouTube, on Quint's YouTube channel and other streaming services. We'll try our best to curate questions from everywhere and present it to the panelists. The session will be from 3 to 4, and we'll see if we can keep the last 5 or 10 minutes or so for questions from the panelists. So great having you guys here. I'm really looking forward to the session. It's a topic that interests us and the audience here as well. Over to you, and over to Dhriti.
Okay, thank you so much, John. It is indeed a pleasure for all of us to be here, and thank you so much to you and the organizers for giving us this opportunity to share our findings and discuss a topic that is really close to our heart. So let me just begin by kind of again taking you all through the main purpose of this particular session, and then we'll jump right in as we have a lot of things we want to share and cover with all of you. So to begin with, I just wanted to say that, this entire movement on evidence-based policy making or evidence-based decision making has so far really sort of emphasized to all of us the importance of rigorous evidence in being able to identify solutions that work, to be able to say, okay, this is something that really works to solve this particular development challenge, and some things that don't work. But once we know that something is an effective program, we know it seems to work with a specific implementation model in a specific context. How do we then take this particular program or intervention to those who are in the decision-making capacity and have the means to reach a large number of people, which typically are policymakers / governments. So JPAL South Asia has been working very closely with the different governments across India, and our focus now is that how do we really first get this program or make even governments aware that some of the solution exists? So what does it really take to kind of convince governments that they should make a particular program a part of their strategy. And then the second part of the question is that once you have done that, once the governments understand and are collaborating with organizations and NGOs to scale a solutions, how can we successfully embed this solution or program in existing systems that the government has, to maybe also ensure that there is quality at scale, so that when the maximum number of people are being are benefiting from this program, how do we make sure that that pathway is really strong? So that is something that we will be discussing and talking about in the session today. The speakers that we have for this panel are the ones who have really been working on the front lines of this journey of evidence-based scaling up evidence-based programs. And now what I'm going to, and this particular session today, we are structuring it in a mix of presentation and conversation style, and we would love to hear questions from you at the end when we have the Q&A session. So without further ado, what I'll do is I'll start us off with a few slides, and then I will hand it over to our next speaker. So I'm just going to share my screen, and slides are, can everyone see this?
Yes, sure.
Okay, great. Okay, so let me just begin by, for some of you who may not know about JPAL South Asia, although we were in the news quite recently because our founders, Abhijit Banerjee and Esther Duflo, won the Nobel Prize in Economics along with Michael Kremer. So some of you may have come across our name. But very quickly, just to talk a little bit about our organization. So JPAL's mission is to reduce poverty by ensuring that the policy is informed by scientific evidence. We are a research center which is sort of based in MIT, is economic department in the US, and then we have regional offices in different parts of the world. JPAL South Asia is our regional office, and we is one of the largest and the oldest of the JPAL offices. We have three pillars through which we work. So our main pillar is evaluations or generation of high quality evidence. And we do this through our network of affiliated researchers or professors who are in some of the top universities around the world. So in many ways, we serve as a bridge to get this research to answer questions that are extremely important in development economics and in social policy. So the JPAL South Asia office implements this research. So we conduct our own data collection. We run these randomized evaluations on the ground in collaboration with partners like NGOs, different government partners, etc. Then we also, our second pillar is that, well, it's great that, we are generating all of this evidence, but how do we now take this evidence to the policy makers and to other partners? So there we have a policy outreach group that disseminates these findings, that simplifies them, that synthesizes this evidence. And then we also play a role in kind of making sure that the questions that are really relevant to the context that India is grappling with or different state governments may be grappling with also get answered through the research. And finally, we also have the capacity building vertical, and we are hosting the CLEAR initiative, where the focus is to develop M&E capacity in the global south and with the range of stakeholders. So that's a very quick introduction about what we do. Now, what we are going to really do in this particular session is that we are going to focus on two case studies. And these are both case studies. One is about the Graduating the Ultra Poor program and the work that we've been doing with different state governments in India in partnership with Bandhan Konagar. And the second case study is going to be looking at how do we improve immunization rates among children especially in rural India. And for both of these programs, we are not just going to talk about what the intervention was, what was the evidence, but rather the focus is going to be more on how are we now collaborating with governments to make sure that these programs reach a large number of people who really need these programs. So the first part I'm going to really now deep dive into is this graduation approach, or which was also earlier known as the Targeting the Ultra Poor program. And what I would like to do here is to just again set up what the intervention was. But the main idea would be to really focus on sharing some of the lessons that we have learned through this journey. So again, now here it's really important for us to understand the exact problem that this program seeks to answer. So the main thing here is that, poverty is really not a dichotomous category of poor and non-poor. But if we were to unpack poverty, we obviously know through a lot of work that's happened across different disciplines that poverty is really multidimensional in nature. And another way of looking at this is that, relatively speaking, among the group who is poor, the ones who are really at the lowest end of this continuum, the poorest of the poor, the ones who are typically at the margins of the society, are the ones who really may need something very different from just a cash transfer, or even something beyond what the typical social protection schemes that the government may be offering. And why it's really important to focus on this ultra poor category is that they are oftentimes almost invisible, right? They may not have identity cards, they typically don't have bank accounts. So even for governments to reach these people becomes really hard, right? So the focus of this targeting the ultra poor, the graduation approach, is to really try to get these people to come out of the poverty trap in which they are sort of stuck in, and move them to a trajectory of self-employment and meaningful sort of sustainable livelihoods, where once they're out of this particular poverty trap, then they can better connect to the formal social protection schemes that the government or the NGOs may be offering. So essentially, this is what drives the ultra poor program, and it's very important to understand that the target group is very niche, and it is relatively the poorest among the poor people. So, and just again, in terms of the relevance of this particular program in India, so while India has made tremendous strides in economic development across in the previous decade, there's still a substantial population of people who remain in this ultra poor category. And India, while India does not have this definition of less than $2.5 a day, we do have this category of these different deprivation categories. And the SECC data, which was conducted in 2011, it shows that there's still quite a substantial population of women-headed households who are in deprivation across India. And so, like I said, this particular program was pioneered by BRAC in Bangladesh. And this particular program is a time-bound program that is also known as a big push program, where it says that it's not just that giving cash or giving an asset to these ultra poor households is enough. You really need to give them an entire range of things at the same time to literally push them through this this poverty trap. And so it begins with a clear identification, where you really go deep into trying to identify who these ultra poor people are at a village level. Then there is a productive transfer of a productive asset, which again is identified in conversations with these beneficiaries. Then you also give them weekly stipends, you give them trainings, you give them a lot of hand-holding support for 2 years until the time that they can start working on this particular asset. And this asset could also be enterprise. So many times it's livestock, but you could also be opening small kirana shops and things like that. And then these women, once they are doing well on a range of indicators, they then get linked into any of the formal social protection schemes or microcredit or microfinance schemes that may be relevant to that context. So now the first question, of course, is that this particular program really worked in Bangladesh. It had a major impact. There were impact evaluations done of this program in Bangladesh by different researchers. But then the question was, well, can this be replicated in other countries when it is implemented by an organization other than BRAC? And for that to happen, there was a CGAP and Ford Foundation put together this coalition, where this particular program was evaluated across 6 countries. And in all of these countries, we found very positive impacts across a whole range of indicators, starting from income, consumption, food security, mental health, and so on and so forth. And we find that across all of these 6 countries, the gains were quite meaningful. And even in countries such as Honduras, where the relative magnitude of the result was not as high, we still found substantial gains in an indicator such as food security. Now, the second question is, well, this does seem to work in other countries, but is this program sustainable? Will the impacts continue to hold even if, say, 5 years down the line. And to that, again, we have data from both Bangladesh and India, which shows that even 7 years after the program, the participants who were a part of the graduation approach continue to remain doing much better in terms of the savings that they had and in terms of their ability to deal with financial shocks and so on and so forth. Then the third question, of course, is this cost effective? Because this program does have cost. So it's about rupees 30,000 per participant for a course of 2 years. But again, half of that cost is the asset cost as well as the cost of the stipend that they get. The rest of the cost is the cost of the personnel that is going to make sure that there is hand holding and all of these components. And what we have realized is that this particular program is highly cost effective, and especially because it is sustainable as well. If you take into account the long-term impacts, it really gives you a good social return for your investment. And it's also really important that if you take off everything else and just focus on the cash transfer or the asset, it may not work. So you basically need all of these things together to work. So that is where I basically would say, you know, what we were able to answer, and it was a very compelling solutions for countries such as India that continue to have this problem of ultra poor people. So then now our story begins with trying to answer this question now that, well, this does seem to work. This seems to work in different contexts. It's cost effective. It has sustainable impacts. But can governments really make it a part and parcel of their social protection strategy and scheme? And here we have been having conversations with different state governments, and we've been quite successful to forge partnerships across 4 state governments. The 4th one with Odisha is very much at an advanced stage. But Rajasthan government, for example, is already funding this particular program, and they have funded this with 1,000 households where Bandhan Konagar, who's our partner, implemented it. In Jharkhand, the government is taking it to about 7,000 households. But it is in Bihar where we have had a very huge success with Jivika, not only providing funding for this program, but also Jivika themselves implementing this program and scaling it up to reach 100,000 ultra poor families in Bihar. This is the SJY program, which is a part and parcel of a particular scheme that the government of Bihar is rolling out. And these are the different aspects of our journey to kind of reach to this particular milestone or stage. And the government has announced $115 million to scale up the ultra poor program in the form of SJY. Now, what I would like to do is I would like to end my presentation here and actually hand it over to my colleague Gautam, who is going to take us through who is going to take us through some important learnings and lessons that he has learned during his journey and during the time, all this time when he's been leading the TUP strategy and working very closely with Jivika and other state governments. So I'm trying to stop my screen sharing, but in the meantime, Gautam, over to you.
Yep. Thank you, Shagun, for setting this up, and good afternoon, everyone. You're looking forward to discussing and also hearing your questions in the time that we'll have at the end. So first of all, what I'd like to talk about is typically, I think when we think of working with government, the first things that come to mind is it takes a lot of time. Maybe one of the first skills we need is something called patience, and we're sometimes waiting for permissions and decisions to be made, and governments are long-term, they're very stable. So instead, what I want to share with people is what has stood out for me as exciting and energizing. As Shagun mentioned, we've worked with a range of state governments on this particular program in India, the government of Jharkhand, Rajasthan, Orissa, and Bihar, and all very different experiences, both with that government, but also in the nature of the scale-up pathway as well. And we'll talk more about that as well. So as I mentioned, I'm going to begin with why has it been energizing, and why has it been exciting? And for me, I'd like to say is that these governments that we've been collaborating with formally, they've given that opportunity, they've listened to us so we can share evidence from the research Shagun talked about to inform their systems, the large scale systems for more impact as well. And to me, that's been one of the most exciting parts. So one question could be, when we first have that first meeting, we're going to meet someone who is a decision maker in policy. what do we do? What do we do in that meeting? What I would like to say is almost think about the other way around. So this person who's the policymaker, decision maker, somebody who is managing a large scale system, what are they expecting from us before we come into the room? And what I'd like to say is, Shagun explained the research. It's rigorous, it's scientific. We spend a lot of time making sure that we can isolate impact and talk about that. But for that person, the person at government who we're going to meet, they are reaching out to millions on a daily basis, and the workforce they have, the types of services or goods that the supply chains have to manage, are incredibly complex, and day on everyday things have to work and have to happen. And they're about to hear from us on research, which is a substantial sample size. The sample size Shagun talked about was from 10,000 households. But just in terms of perspectives, what I'd like to highlight here is they're looking at something very, very different. So I would like to say, in terms of when we are coming to these first meetings, we're first trying to engage a government who's responsible for that type of delivery and a system that supports the poorest come out of extreme poverty. How do we connect the two? How do we connect something from research to the system they're running? And my own learning from this, my biggest learning is that in some ways, yes, we are a research center, as you heard, we're a knowledge partner, absolutely. But in these collaborations, I think we're there also to learn. We're a major learning partner. And the way that is because, yes, we're coming to them with research, but we need to learn about their context, what's happening in that geography, what their workforce is capable of. Takes time to understand and learn, to do surveys, collect data on. What socially might be acceptable or what socially might be motivating in their context. So that there are several soft, hard, what finances might be available to maneuver. So there'll be some tangible, intangible aspects that if we don't understand from them how their system runs, there's very little chance that so the findings for this graduation approach or findings from another program, how they can be embedded, there's very little chance for that. So what I'm saying is for that first meeting, we're engaging a government. I think it's most important we take a learning mentality and try to gain from them how their system operates. And then what we are sharing with them is what we have found has been impactful, that has been effective from the studies we've done. How can those two come together in a collaboration for a large-scale change? And that's what we had in Bihar. So you might recall in the slide Shagun had shown that in Bihar, the government is committed to reach 100,000 households in the first phase across 3 years with 840 crore through their own system, through Jivika, which is a state rural livelihoods mission, which has set up the self-help groups, the SHGs and the federation, and the set up of village organizations. So that in itself, I think when we first began this work about 5 years ago, we may not have imagined that we would be working on such as a partner on such a large system. So it has been very ambitious to work with the government, with that vision, and for us to bring evidence there. So I'd like to, Shagun, what more would you like me to talk about, Shagun?
Thanks so much, Gautam. I think this was very interesting to really hear about the first piece, where it is about how do we get governments to come on this journey of evidence-based scale-up. Now, my second question to you is then, how can organizations such as ourselves support the governments to plan and execute system change so that such programs can be embedded in their existing systems?
Okay, yeah, thanks, Shagun. That's a good question from the heart, that you're actually asking a question at the heart of how, as research organizations, can we collaborate with government. And you can even think of this broader, people in the audience. It could be just like, if you have an innovation, if you have an idea of something that can work, you might still want to build on terms of evidence of impact, but you might, for that idea, for you to connect that with government, how do we go about it? So what I'd like to share, I'm going to share two things there are many things, I'd like to share two things that stand out. So the first one is that when we when we do research of a program, of a context, we have a lot of focus, intense time, and we make that very clear in the sense that we have that time to understand things like the theory of change, the logic of it. What were the parts of the program? How did impact happen? What was the beneficiary's experience? What was the frontline workers' experience? So we're working in a very intense way to understand something with a lot of specificity and to look at the outcomes over time. Now coming to what we're trying to do, but that's very different to the system where we want to collaborate with, which is a large-scale system where things are running all the time, and we want to see what from there can we use in the system. How can the system absorb from what is impactful? So I'd say, Shagun, I think one of the first things that we can do in this collaboration, we can do a deep assessment of the ground reality in the context. So what I mean by this is, so let me just take Bihar as one of the examples where we've worked closely. What capacities do frontline workers in Bihar have? What number of frontline workers are there in ratio to the beneficiaries that we want to engage? How are they managed? What type of interactions do they have with their management team for feedback flows to move up and down between the frontline worker and the management team above? Similarly, so for example, in Bihar itself, the SHGs are they're matured in a way that they've been meeting for a long time. They have behaviors and processes that are quite well set. They are federated into the VLOs and a unit above them at the cluster level. That institution has well practiced, and that can take on a role, for example, of oversight, fairness, even financial flows, which may not be available in all parts of India, as in there's been a long time investing in that setup. So by understanding these pieces, frontline workers is one, institutions at the community level is another, political drive and motivation to sustain something once it gets going. This is a 2-year program, as you've heard, so it's a long time to sustain how the innovation gets picked up. Spending time with the partner, how all those pieces exist and what they can do, that's the opportunity. And then from our side as a research, combining that with what are the working parts of the model. So yes, they will understand impact, the cost effectiveness slides you saw, but unless we can understand what's the functioning mechanism, which bit needs to work on the ground and how, it can't be absorbed in. So I think one role that we've spent a lot of time on is making both those maps very clear. The map of the large scale existing system in Bihar, and what are the working parts from our research, and then understanding how they can be, what modifications might be needed for that to run in the system. So what works, what's effective, what's impactful. But the next question for scale up is, how can that be scalable? I'll give one example of this to make it a little clearer. So BRAC, Bandhan Konaga, the many NGOs who run this graduation program, they have a very grassrooted model of identifying the ultra poor. This involves making a map of the village, walking in the village, involving all the village members in a large meeting to go house to house and identify marginalized households, all households, and use a card system to rank their wealth. So that sounds excellent. It's so thorough. It sounds like this is one of the best ways to make sure we don't lose some. We include all the ultra poor. And when we see it on the field, and when the government also saw this on the field in our demonstrations, in Bandhan Konaga's demonstrations, it's impressive because it's so thorough. And that's actually what we want to happen. We don't want to miss anybody out who needs this support. So now coming to that as a working part, can it work at scale? So after some pilots, the reason why it couldn't, because now if we think about that, the actual person running that meeting, who's come into the village for a few days to run that meeting, is under tremendous pressure. People will question things. There might be a conflict in the village of somebody saying this person has extra assets, or they have somebody who's migrated far away sending them money, and they're not talking about that. It can be very personal and sensitive to talk about wealth at the village level in a public way. And if this person doesn't have negotiation skills, they don't have tremendous, remarkable patience and ability to calm a crowd, it can be terrifying. And not just terrifying, it can't be scalable. For Bihar, who want to reach 100,000 beneficiaries across a fixed period of time, running something intense like this was not scalable. So we worked with the government, and they piloted different versions of this. The staff can code, keeping some of those elements. And we double checked. We did back check, there weren't issues in including the wrong people, excluding some people. And that way we made you might use the word diluted or a distilled version of that. So keeping the parts to ensure that it's accurate to get to poor, but not as long and thorough as a grassroots organization would manage. And I'll just mention one more thing. So the other part I think is incredibly important, where we can combine, is about measurement. Research organizers obviously were excellent, and it's one of the key things to do, but how can it work for frontline workers, managers of that context? So what we've done is make sure we pilot with them on the ground in their context, so that it works for them. It's simpler. It ends up not being an academic paper, but being a dashboard, a timely dashboard for district managers, state managers, to be able to course correct and adapt and fine-tune their system as well. So to sum up, the two things I think that stand out for me is one, mapping research understanding, two, working parts that can be operated at large scale, and two, an MIS that is designed with the people who will use it, both from frontline, district and state in terms of the dashboard, and making something that works for them. And back to you, Shagun.
Thank you so much, Gautam. I think that was, I found this extremely insightful, and I am hoping that others did too. So now I'm going to actually move over to our second speaker, Aparna. And I would actually now like us to talk about another example, which is in the space of routine immunization for children. And I think at this time, when we're all reeling under the COVID-19 crisis, this particular topic takes on even more salience, that how do we make sure that our health services continue to reach this very important target group. What I would really like Aparna is to take us through this innovation that we did in Haryana. And we did it through a study that recently got completed, and we are looking to publish the working paper very soon. But in the meantime, we are also at an advanced stage of working with the government of Haryana to embed this program into their systems. So over to you, Aparna. And I will also pull out the presentation.
Thank you. So as you'll see, when I go through the presentation, the starting point for Haryana was a little bit different from what Gautam explained for the graduation approach. So here is a project that was tested, and we are engaged with the government to scale it up in the same context. I'll take you through the program itself, since not everyone may be familiar with it, and then we can talk a little bit more on the experience around scaling. So the starting point for the research study, it in fact predates Haryana. The proof of concept was tested with an NGO in Udaipur district, Seva Mandir, in almost 2004-5. And this is also a project that's close to my heart, since I've seen this grow over many years now. And this, unfortunately, in some ways, the starting point remains the same. Maybe the level has changed quite a bit. But the fundamental issue is that immunization plummets with every increasing or later shot of vaccines. And so you'll see on the graph that between the 4th and the 5th vaccine, which is basically when the child is 14 weeks and 36 weeks, is where there is a sharp drop in immunization. Now, people could forget, maybe people haven't understood the need for immunizations. There's a bunch of behavioral biases. In Western developed economies, there is often a negative incentive or a disincentive, in the sense that if your child is not immunized, she would not get admission in schools. Whereas, here it's maybe easy to forget, or you'd postpone it and things slip. So there could be a number of demand side things that may be going on, because on the supply side, over the last 2 decades, for sure, there's been a substantial and significant improvement in government efforts to outreach at the village level. There are campaigns, vaccines are free, polio has almost eradicated. So we know that some of these campaign drives are working, but what constrains this last mile problem, and how can we overcome this issue and achieve 100% full immunization for some of these key vaccine preventable diseases, which as Shagun said, no better time than now to win that battle against lack of take-up of full immunization. So this is what launched our engagement with the government of Haryana. If you could move to the next slide, Shagun. It's called the Teekakaran Protsahan Karyakram, or TPK. And you'll see that a conversation started almost in 2013 to about 2019. So in some ways, setting up a research project could take much longer than a scale-up conversation almost. The program itself, both the intervention as well as the evaluation, ran for maybe a little under 2 years, from mid-2016 to about early 2018. With the intervention itself, which I'll take you through in a minute, there were 2 or 3 innovative ideas that were tried that ran for about 15 odd months. If you could move to the next slide, please. Right. So what were these questions? If you remember, I briefly alluded to what could be constraining take-up of full immunization. So we thought about how can nudges and communication strategies play a role in bringing about some of this behavior change if you're looking at largely demand-side constraints to immunization? So one is, it's expensive. You have to take time out in your day. You have to go to the health sub-center or the primary healthcare center in your village or in the nearby village. It means probably at least half a day's work which is lost, or maybe a full day's work. So, people don't tend to prioritize it. Salience is another thing. It's much easier to go to the doctor when you're not well and get a shot rather than get this injection thinking that you will not fall ill, say 15 years from now, if you were to get this medicine now. So it is natural to focus on something that is more prominent and more immediate rather than something that, even though you're convinced of its benefits, tends to get a lower priority. And that's human nature. It's not a problem with the poor or non-poor, it's across the board. Some of it could just be lack of awareness or lack of communication at the village level. There's not enough information yet on benefits. There are other confounding factors. People are very confused. So there were 3 sets of things that were tried as part of the research experiment. One was to say, can we give people small mobile recharges? So this went from 250 rupees to 450 rupees for the full immunization schedule, starting from as little as 10 rupees per vaccine shot to about 200. So because we're economists, we tried a few different things. One which said, can you give people a flat amount for every visit? And one which said, can you increase it with every increasing shot? And so at measles, you would get your highest amount. So which sort of incentivized people to remember and to come to the immunization centers. The other one, which is very exciting and something that built off many years of social networks research, was information nodes. Can you find people within the community, identified by the community themselves, who could act as disseminators, right? Or people who would spread information. And what we did was a very simple survey that asked people, who do you trust in your village? You see governments often relying on panchayat workers or Anganwadi workers for the last mile outreach of their programs. This was asking people themselves in the village on who they would trust, who they got their information from. So these are called gossips in network theory. Or just seeding people randomly in a village with this information. So these people, once they were identified, were given information about immunization, which the expectation was then that they would pass it on to other people. And similarly, there were also tailored SMS, which now almost everybody gets, which reminds you that your child is up for Penta 3 vaccine on this particular date, and so please show up. So these were the 3 things that were tried as part of the government's TPK program, and the research itself was at scale. So you'll see even in Udaipur, we worked in 1 district and about 90 villages. Here we were across 7 districts, 140 PHCs covering almost 950 villages with 1,300 frontline workers, all part of this program. And close to 300,000 children were enrolled over this time into the immunization services, of which about almost over 80,000 had completed the full immunization schedule. So this was a massive exercise from our side, but this was precisely the reason to test things at scale, which is much more relevant in being able to talk to governments about how to run the program at scale if it were found to be effective. To the next slide, please. And also animate. Thank you. So in addition to creating a brand new MIS, because that at that point it did not exist within the government to just track the delivery of immunization services and the outcomes, what we also did a bunch of household surveys to collect information from the beneficiary side. And so what worked finally was, and maybe to a little bit surprisingly as well, was that the gossips intervention combined with these reminders. So gossips, if you remember, are people who just spread information about a program, which says, which is essentially giving them, you ask people, who do you go to find out about the Mela in your village, or who do you go to about information on government schemes? These are the gossips, and they were effective at spreading information. So they could be random people. Maybe someone's a teacher, but maybe someone's just a neighbor in your next door. Similarly, the sloped incentives were very effective. In fact, it was the combination of providing a small nudge combined with the ambassadors or the gossips, which had the most effect on increasing full immunization rates as compared to control groups in the study. The SMS reminders, unsurprisingly, by itself did not have any effect. It was only when it was combined with the gossip's intervention that it helped actually have any impact at all. So yeah, so that was where we ended with the study, and since then we've been talking to the government to see whether they would be interested in taking this program forward. Sorry, it took a fair bit of time to go through the experiment, but Shagun, does that cover all of the key features?
Yes, Aparna, it does. Do you want to continue?
Sure. So, going on the scaling story, then what happened was, as I mentioned at the beginning, this was a program that was in collaboration with the Haryana government. So to quote a line that we often heard from them was, if it could work in Mewat, it would work everywhere else. Mewat was one of the 7 study districts where the study was implemented. So in some ways, the conversations about how is this program effective, would it work at scale, were all answered because they were the research partner on the ground. Not only did they see every part of the process and were involved in design decisions around the intervention, they also saw what didn't work. So all of the challenges on what went wrong, how to fix it, they were there at every step of the way. And despite the few bureaucratic transfers that we had over the course of the project sustained and it finished, and it had in some ways institutionalized in the memory of the department, which is something that all of us try and target to do. It happens in strange ways, but by the end of the project, it had gone on file, so to speak, where it was a program that was supported and co-run by the government. So it went a little bit beyond our expectations, where they not only wanted to see how to scale up the couple of insights that were coming from the study and were engaged with us to see what were the cost implications. The gossips model, which I talked about, is almost costless. In some ways, it reduces the cost per child for vaccination, because for almost zero cost, you send out messages to these people who are not paid. They're just, they tend to be information disseminators naturally. So if more children come to the center, the fixed cost of providing immunization services goes down. The cost of course, adding an incentive, whether it's 50 rupees per person or 200 rupees per person, there is an additional cost to that program. So that does increase the cost of the service itself, but it also has a larger impact on the number of the increase in full immunization coverage. So that's the trade-off that the government is thinking of. And the way they're planning this out is to say, let's use the gossips plus reminders everywhere, because it's a very cost-effective intervention to do, and target the incentives in areas where they particularly have challenges with low immunization rates or very imbalanced rates across within a district. And so we signed another MOU last year, which went beyond immunization, because one of the key takeaways for the government was how to use health systems information and health systems data better for decisions. So this is really now an ongoing engagement with them to say, while we scale up this program, how else can we learn from our data on where the gaps are, and how could we innovate around it? So I think we're particularly very impressed and also thankful for the kind of vision and support that the Haryana government has provided on this engagement, and we're excited to see what happens. It's early days on scaling still, but we're off to a promising start. So, thanks, Shagun. I mean, I think if we have time, we can go through this, Shagun. Otherwise, I'm also happy to. I'm conscious of time.
Yes, Aparna. So then let's do one thing. I think while this would be interesting, there are some exciting questions which relate more to the learnings that we would love to share during this discussion. So I'm going to stop the screen sharing, and let's move to the questions now. So one of the main questions I had for you, Aparna, was how do we, what were some of the challenges, what were some of the things that helped when we were in discussions with the government of Haryana to think about the scale up of this program?
Right. So one, as I already mentioned, because they were part of the process itself, the demand was in some ways already there, right? So they were convinced through participating in the research itself. Second, I think also is in some ways they were dealing with last mile problems in some districts. So the problem was well articulated and formulated to say that despite many of the efforts that they were taking, what more could they do in these hard to reach areas or hard to reach populations within certain districts and certain geographies. So it spoke nicely to, I think, or in a timely manner to the challenges that the government was facing at that point in time. So that was, I think that helped a lot to be there in that context. And as you saw, it was a very long engagement as well. So there's a lot of patience, as Gautam said. You learn to bring that to the table almost right from the start. So that was in some ways set up the conversation well. You know, what I think is challenging for us right now is more about operationalizing it. And I think Gautam also probably alluded to this in the conversation. Once they have decided to do something on a large scale, then governments can actually move very quickly as much as it takes them a long time to start things off or to change. Once a decision's taken, then it needs to move quickly, which also means systems have to be ready in place. So that's the stage we're at now, where we're trying to figure out if they have in the meantime developed their own MI system for delivery of maternal and child health services. How could we leverage that to actually operationalize and implement these programs? So because it's no longer just a small tweak to their program, it does require a fair amount of infrastructure. Data needs to be reliable because it is on the basis of this data that messages are going out or incentives would be given. So it's critical to ensure. So we had a few practices in the research project, much like the graduation approach as well, where there was an independent back check or an independent validation of a subset of the data. And our attempt now is to try and internalize that within the government department so that they don't have to rely on an external team to do data collection or to verify this. And if we can institutionalize some of these practices within government, then I think we would be on track for a scale up of a program in a manner that was accomplished during the lab experiment in some ways, during the research study itself.
Thanks, Aparna. I think my second question you've already partly answered, but it was again going back to say, are there any other things that you want to share on the importance of data and also systems level data in ensuring quality at scale?
Yeah, you know, that's exactly, I think, as I mentioned, it's part of the challenge and it's also the opportunity in this case where, given this larger vision that that government has to use health systems data better, the first step is really data quality. And as researchers, that is front and center to everything that we do. There could be challenges on the field with things like, you know, tablets not working or the frontline workers not being familiar with the interface. There could be a lag in the data entry, and we're facing a little bit of all of this right now as well. It takes time for these changes to happen within government systems to go from paper to digital. It takes a while, and so there is. What I think is really useful in this time is this feedback loop to the government. Often data flows from the bottom to the top within a government, and what is important is to make sure that it also flows back down from the top levels to every level, from district block and to the frontline workers, so that people see how it is actionable and it is not just a means of checking or audit, but it's really a tool for planning or for decision making. So through our efforts in trying to integrate these data validation practices and data quality practices, we hope that it can institutionalize the process of working with data. That's part of it. The second question, again, as researchers, which we worry about is, at scale, would we see the same sort of impacts as we did during the research project? That was one of the motivations also to do research at scale. When you do it on such a large area, you're kind of getting a sense of representativeness in that context and beyond. And so it is important then that these systems that are in place, so the government uses now a system called ANMOL, which the government of India has also rolled out across many states. That becomes the basis for tracking whether services were delivered, but also what happens at the level of the beneficiary, what happens to outcomes. Do people come back? Is there a drop-off between the last two vaccines? So that sort of somebody needs to look at this data constantly, and it has to be someone's job also within the government, not just to make these reports or tables, but also present it in a way that it's actionable and that different levels can immediately react to the problems or the gaps that they see in data. So that is, I think, how they maintain what we broadly call monitoring and evaluation systems, but it's really about making data usable and actionable, and what are some things that we can learn from the research experiment that can sustain through the program at scale. And that's our hope with this engagement, is to help put some of those practices in place, which can then be run by the government themselves.
Great. Okay, so this was very interesting, and we only have 10 minutes left now, and there are some really interesting questions that are coming from the audience. So what I would now do is I would just quickly wrap up and synthesize, and then we'll open and take a few questions. So I think from my side, what I would like to say is someone who's not just been engaged in these two programs, but overall sort of leading the scale-up strategy of JPAL South Asia. I see that a number of things that Aparna and Gautam have shared with us today, as well as what I began with in my opening presentation, is to say that generation of high quality evidence is really, really important and help us pick and choose which programs we want to push for to reach many people. But then the role of data and evidence continues to become even more salient as we move to the next level of trying to make this program reach many more people and while maintaining quality. And again, when you are thinking about data, it's not just about collecting high quality household surveys, which we of course do. It's really about a mix of different types of tools that you want to use for this to happen. So Aparna touched upon a little bit on the importance of looking at MIS data that the government may already have, also working closely with governments to really inform them on how they can make it usable and actionable in terms of how are this data being produced, what type of tables are coming out, what type of indicators are coming out of these data sets. Can the ANMs actually look at it and have some feedback loop on their own performance on a regular basis? But then what we are doing in Bihar, where I'm also working as a researcher on this particular project, is to see, can we also collect data directly from the field, and we can then triangulate that with the MIS that the government has to make sure that are there certain systematic gaps that are happening. And finally, to the points that Gautam really made, is to really also change our lens and make it almost like a shared vision where each of us are coming with different skill sets, different comparative advantages, but with the government system being at the center, we really have to look at solutions from their perspective. So even as we think about, from NGOs who may be the ones who are innovating on these amazing programs, who are working with different organizations to test them, working with people, but then for NGOs to really think about how this program can be scaled, they will have to think about adaptations. They will have to think about how do you really make this program even work when the capacity of those implementing this on the ground is very low, right? So, and here I feel technology is something that can really help us, both in terms of thinking about the roles that NGOs can play as technical assistance partners to governments, not as direct implementers, and the role that technology can play in terms of producing ongoing data that we then analyze and use. So let me end here and let me look at some of the questions that we have coming in from the audience. So what I'll do is I will ask some of these questions to you, Aparna and Gautam, and if there's something that I feel I can answer, I may take that on myself. So first question I wanted to ask Gautam was, what were the facilitators and barriers of scaling up the graduation approach in other states of India? And Gautam, when you answer this, it will be great if you could also talk a little bit about the fact that NRLM is also a very important, social protection structure that the government has set up. Over to you, Gautam.
Sorry, Shagun, could you just repeat the last part of the question?
So the question was basically, what were the facilitators and barriers of scaling up the graduation approach in other states in India?
I see. Great. So, this is a good question, and can't be covered in a minute or even an hour, perhaps. So let me just try and give a couple of ideas for this. I say this can be perceptions in the sense of financially what the cost is, what the impact could be, and equally what past history that state has had in previous attempts, previous programs, and understanding how in a sense, many state governments have given assets. Many state governments have tried through types of mentoring. They've looked at business practices. One learning from this set of evidence was about how the sequence makes a difference and the thoroughness makes a difference. And for that, I would say, almost like, let me give the answer, but in the best way to do this, I think it's demonstrations are very, very helpful. So research is one part, but seeing a live demonstration, either in a state similar or even in the own state where we're looking to have the conversation, having a pilot that lets people see the operations happen, meet the people who are doing operations. It could be an NGO pilot, and talk to beneficiaries. I think that's one of the best ways to answer what people see, maybe as they see them as barriers or constraints, by just running a small version.
Okay, thanks so much, Gautam. And I think just to add to this, I think, like Gautam already said, I think it's also really important that the government has invested in the National Rural Livelihoods Mission, which is a loan-based model, right? And for them to also then understand and recognize that while this loan-based model is covering a large proportion of women in different states through the self-help group movement, there may be some groups of people who are systematically being left out. And the graduation approach is essentially a grant-based model. So it did take some time to convince or to kind of have these conversations where the governments were also trying to see how they can make it a part and parcel of their social protection offering. And I think those are this political will, this really willingness to understand that, well, the existing social protection system may be having great benefits for a large majority. There still be some pockets that may need a more customized approach. Okay, so the next question I have is for you, Aparna, where I think there are a couple of questions, and so I'm kind of clubbing them together, which is that what are the key points to consider when we scale up a program for a region into a state? And a similar question is also to say that can we think, which is the generalizability puzzle, on when a program has been tested in some demography, can we take it to other contexts as well? So if you could shed some light on that.
Yeah, and you should add to this as well, again. Absolutely, I think some of these larger studies, larger sample size, multiple interventions, engaging with the policymakers or your partners, research partners, it could be nonprofits as well, to design asking the right questions goes a long way, I think, in also ensuring that you have answers to some of these questions that come on later on how to scale programs. It looks at I saw one of the questions that also mentioned this and talked about it could become costly to do multiple evaluations or larger scale ones. There is a lot of promise with administrative data as some of these data systems come into place, both through data providers like the government. To be able to rely on that for measurement of key outcomes also reduces the cost of doing some of these large scale studies. And so we are very hopeful over time. A part of my job is also looking to see how we can help governments improve the quality of their data and use it for purposes beyond the MIS needs itself. So briefly, I would say these are things you could do ex ante in trying to set up an experiment that can go to scale and is replicable. Ex post is, of course, doing an assessment of the exact problems that are faced in a new context and trying to compare it to what the evaluation addressed and making sure that it's contextualized. So it's a combination of this evidence from rigorous research, but also grounded in local knowledge and an understanding of the problems there, so that the solution is tailored to the problem.
Great, thanks so much, Aparna. So we just have, I think, 3 to 4 minutes left, but I did want to ask this one question to Gautam, and I think he is like the best person to answer this. And this question is saying that it will be helpful to understand what governance structure is on such programs. Curious to know how the interaction and decision making takes place between JPAL, public sector, and other entities. So Gautam, if you could just say a little bit about this in 2 minutes, that would be great.
Sure. So if I understood the question rightly, it was about the decision-making process and how we engage with that.
Exactly. So how do we engage with governments to make sure that this continues? Yeah.
Okay. So I'm going to give almost like our organizational answer to this, but one that I actually believe very personally in. So I think one of our answers is data and facts. And what I mean by that is, so governments have a lot of information with them. They have their own departments that collect data as well. They have many people sending them ideas. They will read many things externally. how they sort through that to understand what is a right fit for them, what can be impactful. And to me, it's good data. So good data in a sense, showing the government how we generated that data. Where did it come from? How did we ask the questions? How did we set up the measurement tools to come to that answer? I think explaining that really helps them understand what set of information will inform the decision. So to me, that's a simple way to say it, but what I would say broadly, I think governments can be very crowded by a lot of information. So it's our job to distinguish what is different, what fits their context, and what's good quality data.
Great. Thank you so much, Gautam. I think we are really sort of out of time now. So, John, over to you for closing the session.
Thanks, everyone. Thanks so much. I think I was just looking at the questions that were coming in. Very good questions, good quality questions, and obviously a high quality discussion as well. Just to the viewers, we have this streaming live on Quint on YouTube channels. Yesterday we had 10,000 viewers joining in across 45 countries. I'm sure we'll add more to that. There are questions on when the YouTube links will be available for viewing later. They are live. They are available on YouTube. You can view them anytime. I just want to get back to the panel. Thank you so much for taking time out. These are really valuable lessons, and I hope we can keep working together. There's an audience for this, and as I look at the questions that comes here, thank you so much, Gautam, Shagun, and Aparna. It was lovely having you here.